Berlin, January 1919. The city smells of gunpowder and winter rain. In a darkened apartment, a small woman with luminous eyes writes by candlelight, her pen moving across paper even as the sound of rifles echoes through the streets below. She knows they are coming for her. She has always known. But Rosa Luxemburg keeps writing, because some truths refuse to stay silent, even when silence might save your life. Tonight, we follow the story of a woman who could barely walk but shook empires with her words, a revolutionary who quoted Goethe between manifestos, a fighter who wept over fallen sparrows. Her life was a contradiction that history has never quite known how to hold, fierce yet tender, uncompromising yet full of doubt. She believed in the power of ordinary people to reshape the world, and she died at their hands, thrown into a canal on a frozen winter night. Before we begin this quiet journey into her remarkable and heartbreaking life, let us prepare for what lies ahead. This is not a story with easy answers. It is a story about conviction and its cost, about loving the world enough to fight for it, even when the world does not love you back. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too. A gentle like helps others find their way here, and subscribing means we can continue sharing these stories with you night after night. In the comments, tell us whose life you would like us to explore next. For now, settle in. Let the weight of the day fall away. We will walk together through Rosa's world, and when we reach the end, perhaps we will understand something about courage and beauty and the price of speaking truth. The town of Zamość sits in eastern Poland, though when Rosa Luxemburg was born there on March 5, 1871, it was not called Poland at all. The maps of that time showed only the Russian Empire, stretching endlessly eastward, swallowing smaller nations the way winter swallows light. The Tsar's authority reached into everything: what language you spoke, what books you read, whether you could walk freely down your own street or had to step aside when soldiers passed. Rosa's family lived in a modest house on a quiet street, the kind of place where lace curtains filtered the afternoon sun and the smell of baking bread drifted from the kitchen on Fridays. Her father, Eliash, was a timber merchant, a man whose hands knew the grain of wood and whose mind knew the price of silence. Her mother, Lene, kept a home filled with books in languages the authorities would have frowned upon: Polish, German, Russian, even a little French. In that household, learning was not optional, it was survival. There were 5 children, and Rosa was the youngest, arriving into the world small and fierce, and already marked by something the family could not name. Perhaps it was the intensity in her dark eyes, the way she seemed to observe everything even as an infant. Or perhaps it was simply that she cried less than other babies, as if she had already decided that tears would not help, that the world required something more than softness. When Rosa was 5 years old, her hip began to hurt. At first it seemed like nothing. Children fall, children bruise, but the pain did not fade. It deepened, settled into the bone, and the doctors who examined her in dim rooms shook their heads with that particular gravity that means bad news delivered gently. The diagnosis was unclear. Some said tuberculosis of the bone. Others suspected a misaligned joint that had never healed properly after birth. What mattered was the result. For a year, Rosa lay in bed while her hip was treated with methods that were medieval in their brutality and ineffectiveness. They stretched her leg with weights. They wrapped it in poultices that burned her skin. The pain was extraordinary, the kind that reshapes a child's understanding of what the body can endure. And when she finally rose from that bed and took her first tentative steps, everyone could see that something had changed. Her left leg was shorter now. Her gait would forever carry a limp, a slight rolling motion that marked her as different, as damaged, as less. But Rosa did not weep. She looked at her crooked leg with the same intensity she brought to everything else, and she made a decision that would define her entire life. She would not let this break her. She would not be pitied. She would not shrink into the smallness that the world expected from a crippled Jewish girl in occupied Poland. Instead, she would grow larger on the inside, so large that no one would notice the limp. They would only see the force of her presence. The family moved to Warsaw when Rosa was young, drawn by opportunity and danger in equal measure. Warsaw in the 1870s and 80s was a city of impossible contradictions. Grand boulevards lined with elegant buildings, concealed courtyards where poverty festered like an open wound. Russian authorities patrolled the streets, enforcing laws designed to erase Polish identity itself. Speaking Polish in public schools was forbidden. Polish history was rewritten to emphasize Russian benevolence. Even celebrating certain holidays could bring the police to your door. For Jewish families like the Luxemburgs, the oppression was double-layered. They faced the same anti-Polish policies as their Catholic neighbors, but also the particular cruelties reserved for Jews. Restrictions on where they could live, what professions they could enter. Pogroms that erupted with terrifying regularity, sanctioned by authorities who looked the other way while mobs burned and looted. Rosa grew up knowing that the world was not designed for her safety, that her existence was, in the eyes of the state, provisional, tolerated only so long as she remained invisible and compliant. This knowledge did not make her fearful, it made her angry. And Rosa's anger was not the hot, explosive kind that burns out quickly. It was cold, focused, patient. The kind of anger that studies its enemy and waits for the right moment. She attended the Second Women's Gymnasium, one of the few schools that accepted Jewish girls. Her classmates remember her as brilliant but unsettling. She read constantly, carrying books even when walking through the streets, her eyes scanning pages while her feet navigated cobblestones she had memorized. She devoured novels and philosophy with the same hunger. Goethe and Schiller, Mickiewicz and Swalaki, but also Marx and Engels, those dangerous names whispered in certain circles. By the time Rosa was 15, she had discovered something that would consume the rest of her life. There were people in Warsaw, mostly young, mostly poor, who met in secret to discuss ideas that could get them hanged. They called themselves Socialists, though the word meant different things to different people. Some imagined a future where workers owned the factories they labored in. Others dreamed of a Poland freed from Russian rule. Still others spoke of a transformation so complete that the very structure of society would dissolve and reform into something entirely new. Rosa attended her first meeting in a cramped apartment above a tailor's shop. She climbed 3 flights of narrow stairs, her leg aching with each step, and knocked on a door that opened just wide enough to let her slip inside. The room was thick with cigarette smoke. A dozen young people sat on the floor, on chairs, on the windowsill. Someone was reading aloud from an illegal pamphlet, and when they finished, the arguments began. She sat quietly that first time, listening as they debated tactics and theory. But by her second meeting, she was speaking, and by her third, people were listening. There was something about the way Rosa thought, the precision of her logic, the way she could cut through sentimental rhetoric to expose the machinery underneath. She was 17 years old and already sharper than most of the movement's veteran organizers. The work was dangerous in ways that are difficult to imagine from the comfort of our own time. Carrying a forbidden book could mean imprisonment. Attending an unauthorized meeting could mean exile to Siberia. Writing a revolutionary pamphlet could mean death. And yet, these young people did it anyway, passing leaflets hand to hand in factories, organizing study circles that met in different locations each week to avoid police detection. Rosa threw herself into this underground world with the same intensity she brought to her studies. She helped edit illegal newspapers, writing articles in a coded language that workers understood but authorities could not quite prove was seditious. She tutored new members, explaining economic theory in ways that connected to their lived experience. Why were they hungry while the factory owners grew fat? Why did they work 12-hour days and still could not afford decent housing? The answers were not mysterious, they were structural, embedded in the system itself. The police were always close. There were informers everywhere, desperate people who traded information for a few rubles or the promise of leniency. Rosa learned to be careful, but not paranoid. She learned to read a room in seconds, to identify the exits, to memorize faces. She learned the particular silence that falls over a crowd when someone dangerous has entered. And she learned that fear was useful only if you did not let it control you. In 1887, the police raided one of the group's safe houses. Several of Rosa's comrades were arrested, and the network that had seemed so secure suddenly collapsed into chaos. Rosa herself was not caught, but she knew it was only a matter of time. The authorities had her name now. They were asking questions, and the walls were closing in. Her parents made a decision. Rosa had to leave Poland. It was not safe for her anymore, and there was nothing they could do to protect her. The plan was simple in theory, terrifying in practice. Rosa would be smuggled across the border into Austrian territory, then make her way to Switzerland, where political refugees could live in relative safety. She was 18 years old. She had never been outside of Russian Poland. She spoke several languages but had no money, no connections, no idea what waited for her beyond the border. Her mother wept when they said goodbye. Her father pressed a small amount of cash into her hand and told her to write when she arrived, if she arrived. Her siblings embraced her one by one, and Rosa felt the weight of it, the severing, the knowledge that she might never see any of them again. The journey itself was a blur of night trains and forged documents, of hiding in the back of wagons and walking through forests when the roads were too closely watched. Rosa's hip ached constantly, the cold and exertion making the old injury flare, but she did not complain. She put one foot in front of the other, her crooked gait carrying her toward a future she could not see but believed in absolutely. When she finally crossed into Switzerland in early 1889, collapsing onto a train platform in Zurich with nothing but the clothes on her back and her father's money sewn into her coat, Rosa Luxemburg felt something she had not allowed herself to feel before. Not relief exactly, not safety, but possibility. The border was behind her. The empire that had tried to make her small and silent had lost its grip. She stood on that platform, a teenage refugee with a limp and a head full of dangerous ideas, and she looked around at the Swiss city rising up the hillside, clean and prosperous and utterly foreign. She had no home anymore. She had traded everything familiar for the chance to think freely, to speak freely, to become whatever she was meant to become. The girl who would not be broken had survived, but the real work was only beginning. Ahead lay university, debate, love, betrayal, and a revolution that would consume her whole. Ahead lay a life that would burn so bright it would still be visible a century after it ended. But tonight, on this platform in Zurich, Rosa was simply tired and alone and standing at the threshold of everything. She picked up her small bag, adjusted her weight to compensate for her bad hip, and walked forward into the unknown. The night was cold, but somewhere in the distance, the lights of the city glowed with a warmth that seemed almost like welcome.
Zurich in the 1890s was a city built on water and light. The Limmat River cut through its heart, reflecting the spires of churches that had stood for centuries. The university rose up the hillside, its lecture halls filled with the children of Swiss merchants and the occasional radical exile who had nowhere else to go. It was a city that prided itself on tolerance, or at least on a pragmatic willingness to ignore what happened in the cafes where foreigners gathered to plot the overthrow of governments far away. Rosa arrived with almost nothing and had to build everything from that nothing. She found a tiny room in a boarding house on the edge of the student quarter, a space so small that her bed touched one wall and her desk touched another, leaving barely enough room to turn around. The window looked out onto a courtyard where cats fought over scraps and laundry hung on lines that crisscrossed the gray air. It was cold in winter and hot in summer, and the walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbors arguing, making love, crying into pillows when they thought no one could hear. But it was hers. For the first time in her life, Rosa had a door she could close, a space where no one could tell her what to think or who to be. She hung her few clothes on pegs, she arranged her books on the windowsill where the light was best for reading, and she sat at that tiny desk and began to write letters back to Poland, describing this new world in words that tried to capture both its strangeness and its promise. Money was the constant problem. Her family sent what they could, but it was never enough. Rosa lived on black bread and cheap coffee, on potatoes boiled in her room on a small spirit stove, on whatever she could afford when the hunger became too sharp to ignore. She sewed her own clothes from fabrics she bought at market stalls. She walked everywhere to save the tram fare, her limp making the steep Zurich hills an ordeal that left her hip throbbing by evening. Other students noticed her, though not always kindly. She was foreign, Jewish, poor, female, and she carried herself with a confidence that some found arrogant, as if she believed she had every right to be there, in those lecture halls where women were barely tolerated and often openly mocked. The Swiss students, comfortable and well-fed, sometimes whispered when she passed. The male students, particularly the German and Russian exiles, did not know quite what to make of this small woman who spoke 4 languages fluently and could argue Marx with a precision that left them scrambling. Rosa enrolled in the Faculty of Philosophy, focusing on political economy and law. Her professors were distinguished men who had spent their lives in the genteel pursuit of knowledge, and most of them were not prepared for a student like her. She did not sit quietly in the back of the lecture hall, taking notes and nodding. She asked questions that challenged the premises of entire lectures. She pointed out contradictions in their arguments. She read not just the assigned texts, but the footnotes, the sources, the critics, and she came to class prepared to debate. One professor, Julius Wolff, taught economics from a perspective that assumed capitalism was the natural and inevitable organization of human society. Rosa raised her hand and asked, politely but firmly, how something could be natural if it had only existed for a few hundred years. Wolff's face reddened. He tried to dismiss the question, but Rosa persisted, citing examples from pre-capitalist societies, from commons-based agricultural systems, from gift economies that operated on completely different principles. The other students watched in uncomfortable silence. This was not how things were done. But Rosa did not care how things were done. She cared about truth, about rigor, about not letting comfortable assumptions go unchallenged. And slowly, grudgingly, some of her professors began to respect her. They saw that she was not asking questions to be difficult, but because she genuinely wanted to understand, wanted to push past the surface explanations to the mechanisms underneath. The work consumed her. She studied late into the night, her lamp burning in that tiny room while the city slept around her. She filled notebooks with observations, arguments, citations. She taught herself statistical methods so she could analyze economic data herself rather than trusting others' interpretations. She learned to read Russian economic journals, German philosophical texts, French political theory, moving between languages as easily as other people moved between rooms. But university was only half of Rosa's education. The other half happened in the cafes. Zurich's Niederdorf district was home to a particular kind of establishment. Small cafes with sawdust on the floors and smoke hanging thick in the air, where political exiles from across Europe gathered to argue about the future. Russians fleeing the Tsar's police, Germans avoiding military service, Italians wanted for anarchist activities, Poles like Rosa, stateless and homesick and burning with the need to do something, anything, to change the world they had been forced to leave. She found them, or they found her, and Rosa discovered a community she had not known she was missing. These were people who understood what it meant to live in exile, to carry your country in your heart because you could not go back to it in your body. They met several nights a week,
sometimes in the Café Odeon, sometimes in smaller, more obscure places where the police were less likely to take note. The debates were fierce and endless. What was the path to revolution? Should socialists work within existing governments or smash them entirely? Could capitalism be reformed, or did it need to be abolished? What was the role of violence, of the peasantry, of national liberation movements? The arguments went in circles, fueled by cheap wine and cheaper tobacco, and Rosa threw herself into them with a passion that surprised even her. She met Leo Yagiches in one of those smoke-filled rooms. He was Lithuanian, 24 years old, with the kind of intense gaze that made people uncomfortable. Where Rosa was small and quick and animated, Leo was tall and still and watchful. He came from wealth, or had before he fled, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had never doubted his right to lead.
They argued the first time they spoke. Rosa had presented an analysis of the Polish economy, and Leo had challenged her conclusions, pushing back with a methodical precision that would have annoyed her if it had not been so intellectually honest. They went back and forth for an hour, the others in the cafe gradually falling silent to watch, and by the end, neither had fully convinced the other, but both were exhilarated. It became a pattern. They sought each other out at meetings, drawn by something neither would have called attraction, but that everyone else could see clearly. Leo had ideas about organizing that Rosa found compelling. He believed in building networks, in patient underground work, in creating structures that could survive repression. Rosa brought the theoretical framework, the ability to articulate why the work mattered, to connect daily struggles to historical forces. Their relationship deepened slowly, then all at once. Long walks by the lake where they talked about everything except what was happening between them. Afternoons in Rosa's tiny room, ostensibly to work on pamphlets, but increasingly just to be near each other. The first kiss came after an argument, both of them surprised by the sudden shift from intellectual combat to something far more vulnerable.
What followed was a love affair that would last 15 years, though it would never be simple or easy. Leo was possessive, controlling, quick to jealousy. Rosa was independent, unwilling to subordinate herself to anyone, even someone she loved. They fought constantly, broke up and reunited, wounded each other in ways that left scars. But they also collaborated brilliantly, creating political work that neither could have produced alone. Leo had money from his family, and he gave it freely to support their shared political projects. He financed the printing of pamphlets. He paid Rosa's tuition when her family could not. He became, in effect, her patron, though Rosa chafed at the dependency this created. She wanted to be his equal, not his project. But she also needed to survive, to study, to do the work, and so she accepted his help while resenting the need for it. Through Mio, Rosa became involved with the Polish Socialist movement in exile. There were two main factions, and they hated each other, with the particular venom reserved for comrades who disagree about tactics. The Polish Socialist Party believed that national independence had to come first, that Poland needed to be free from Russian rule before socialism could be built. Rosa and Leo helped found a rival organization, the Social Democracy of the Kingdom of Poland, which argued the opposite. Class struggle transcended national boundaries. Polish workers had more in common with Russian workers than with Polish capitalists. The fight was not for a Polish nation, but for international socialism. This position was deeply unpopular, even among radicals. People called Rosa a traitor to her homeland. They said she had forgotten where she came from, that Swiss comfort had made her indifferent to Polish suffering. The accusations stung because they touched something real. Rosa did feel disconnected from Poland sometimes, abstracted from the daily reality of occupation. But she believed her position was correct, that nationalism was a trap that would divide workers when they needed to unite. The work of building an organization consumed her evenings and weekends, writing manifestos, editing newspapers that would be smuggled across borders, corresponding with workers inside Poland who risked everything to distribute their materials.
Rosa discovered she had a gift for this kind of writing, for taking complex economic theory and translating it into language that resonated with people who had never read Marx. But she never let political work interfere with her studies. If anything, she worked harder, driven by the need to prove herself in both worlds. She attended lectures during the day, organized in the evenings, and studied late into the night. Her health suffered. She had always been fragile, prone to headaches and stomach troubles, and the relentless pace made everything worse. Friends worried about her. Leo tried to make her rest. She ignored them all. By 1897, Rosa was ready to write her doctoral dissertation. She chose a topic that combined her political commitments with rigorous economic analysis: the industrial development of Poland. The thesis examined how Polish industry had grown under Russian rule, arguing that economic integration had created objective conditions that made dreams of an independent Poland economically irrational. Polish capitalism was bound to Russian capitalism. Separation would hurt workers on both sides of the border. The argument was brilliant and deeply controversial. Rosa spent months in libraries, compiling statistics, reading government reports, building an empirical case that could not be dismissed as mere ideology. She wrote in German, her prose clear and precise, avoiding the rhetorical flourishes that marked her political pamphlets. This was scholarship, and it had to meet the highest academic standards. Her dissertation defense took place in the spring of 1897. Rosa stood before a panel of professors, all men, all decades older, all skeptical of this young woman who had invaded their domain. They questioned her methods, they challenged her sources, they probed for weaknesses in her argument. Rosa answered each question with a calm precision that slowly transformed skepticism into respect. When the defense ended, the professors withdrew to deliberate. Rosa waited in the hallway, her hip aching from standing so long, her heart pounding despite her outward composure. After 20 minutes, they called her back in. She had passed. More than passed. They were awarding her degree with distinction, summa cum laude, the highest honor the university could bestow.
She was 26 years old, a woman, a Jew, a cripple, a revolutionary, and now a doctor of philosophy with credentials that no one could dismiss. Rosa walked out of that building into the Zurich afternoon and felt something close to triumph. She had done what they said was impossible. She had proven that a mind mattered more than a body, that intelligence could overcome every disadvantage the world placed in your path. But even in that moment of victory, Rosa knew the degree was only a tool. What mattered was what she did with it. The real work was not in Swiss lecture halls. It was in the factories and streets of Berlin, where the largest socialist movement in the world was growing comfortable, losing its revolutionary edge, becoming something she would have to fight from the inside. Germany was calling. The German Social Democratic Party was a giant, a mass organization with millions of members, and Rosa wanted to shake it awake. Leo would follow her there, though their relationship was already showing cracks. The easy intimacy of their early years was giving way to power struggles, to arguments about who led and who followed. But all of that lay ahead. For now, Rosa stood on a Zurich street corner with her doctorate in hand, watching the light change on the river, feeling the particular ache in her hip that never quite left, and she let herself rest for just a moment. The girl who had limped across the Polish border 8 years ago with nothing had become someone who could not be ignored. The world did not know it yet, but it was about to find out.
She started writing for the party press, articles that appeared in Leipziger Volkszeitung and other socialist papers. Her prose crackled with an energy that made readers sit up. She did not write like the other theorists, in dense paragraphs thick with jargon. She wrote with metaphor and passion, making economic arguments feel like stories about real human lives. When she described exploitation, workers recognized their own exhaustion. When she wrote about revolution, they could see it, almost taste it. But it was her speaking that changed everything. Rosa was invited to address a workers' meeting in a Berlin beer hall in late 1898. She walked to the podium, this tiny woman with her distinctive limp, and the crowd of burly factory workers did not know what to make of her. They had expected someone commanding, someone whose physical presence matched the force of the ideas. What they got was a woman barely 5 feet tall, who had to stand on a box to see over the podium. Then she began to speak, and the room transformed. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. She spoke without notes, her dark eyes moving across the crowd, making contact, drawing each person in. She did not lecture, she conversed, as if speaking to each worker individually about their shared condition. She talked about the factory as a kind of prison, where time was stolen hour by hour, where the products of your hands belonged to someone else, where your body was used up and discarded. She described the strike not as a tactic, but as a dress rehearsal for freedom, a moment when workers discovered their own power. And then she shifted, her voice rising slightly, painting a picture of what could be. A world where those who worked controlled what they made, where decisions were collective, not dictated from above, where human dignity was not a luxury, but a foundation. She spoke of this future not as a distant dream, but as something concrete, waiting just beyond the barricades, reachable if only they had the courage to grasp it.
When she finished, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the room erupted, not just applause, but something deeper. Men who had not cried in decades found tears on their faces. Workers who had been broken by years of grinding labor felt something rekindle inside them, some spark they thought had been extinguished forever. Rosa had done something that transcended politics. She had made them feel human again. Word spread quickly through socialist circles. This newcomer, this Polish woman, had a gift. Invitations poured in. Rosa began traveling across Germany, speaking in beer halls and union offices, in small towns and industrial cities. Everywhere she went, the same thing happened. The crowds came skeptical and left transformed. She had found her calling, the thing her entire life had been preparing her for. But success made enemies as surely as it made admirers. The party leadership watched Rosa's rising influence with growing unease. She was not controllable. She did not defer to authority or soften her positions for the sake of unity. When she disagreed with party policy, she said so publicly in terms that were impossible to ignore. The first major confrontation came over the question of reform versus revolution. Edward Bernstein, one of the party's leading theorists, had begun arguing that Marx was wrong about capitalism's inevitable collapse. The system was adapting, he said. Workers' conditions were improving, not worsening. The path forward was through gradual reform, working within the system to expand democracy and workers' rights. Revolution was an outdated concept, a romantic fantasy that belonged to an earlier, more primitive age. Rosa read Bernstein's arguments with mounting fury. This was not just wrong, it was a betrayal of everything socialism stood for. She wrote a response that became a small book, Social Reform or Revolution, published in 1899. Her argument was precise and devastating. Reforms were good, necessary even, but they could not address the fundamental nature of capitalism. The system was built on exploitation. You could regulate it, humanize it, make it more bearable, but you could not reform away its essential character. That required revolution, a complete transformation of property relations and political power. The book made Rosa famous and marked her as dangerous. Party congresses became battlegrounds where she clashed with the reformist leadership. August Bebel, the party's chairman, respected her intellect, but wished she would be more tactical, more willing to compromise. Rosa refused. Compromise meant slow death, the gradual absorption of the workers' movement into the capitalist state. She debated Karl Kautsky, the party's chief theorist, over the nature of political power. She challenged the trade union leaders who wanted to focus solely on wages and working conditions, ignoring the larger political struggle. She wrote constantly, producing articles, pamphlets, books, her pen moving almost as fast as her mind.
Between 1898 and 1914, Rosa became one of the most prolific and influential socialist writers in Europe. But she was never just a writer. She taught at the party school in Berlin, training young organizers in economics and history. Her lectures were events, the classroom packed with students who hung on her words. She broke down complex theories into pieces they could understand and use. She showed them how to read statistics, how to analyze power, how to see through the lies that propped up the existing order. And she lived, fully and without apology. Rosa loved beauty with an intensity that surprised people who knew her only through her political writing. She collected art, she attended concerts and wept openly at performances of Beethoven. She read novels and poetry, filling her letters with references to Goethe and Schiller. Her apartment became a gathering place for artists and intellectuals, people drawn to her not just for her politics, but for her aliveness, her refusal to flatten herself into a single dimension. She had relationships that scandalized the more conservative party members. After her long, difficult affair with Leo Jogiches ended in bitterness and recrimination, Rosa fell in love with Kostya Zetkin, the son of her close friend Clara. He was 15 years younger, gentle and artistic, everything Leo had not been. The relationship was tender but doomed. Kostya could not handle the intensity of being with someone like Rosa, the constant political demands, the danger, the inability to simply be ordinary. Through it all, Rosa kept writing, speaking, organizing. She traveled to Russia during the 1905 revolution, slipping across the border illegally to witness the uprising firsthand. She was arrested and spent months in a Warsaw prison before being released. The experience taught her something crucial. She saw workers creating their own democratic structures, Soviets where decisions were made collectively. This was what revolution actually looked like. Not a coup by a vanguard party, but masses of people discovering their power and reorganizing society from below. She wrote about this in The Mass Strike, a pamphlet that argued revolution could not be scheduled or controlled. It emerged organically from struggles over immediate demands, spreading like wildfire when conditions were right. The party's job was not to lead the revolution, but to participate in it, to help workers understand the larger implications of their own actions.
The party leaders hated this. They wanted control, predictability, a revolution that would happen according to plan, led by the party apparatus they had spent decades building. Rosa's vision was chaos, beautiful and terrifying, the masses moving faster than any organization could keep up with. It threatened everything they had constructed. By 1910, Rosa was isolated within the leadership. She still had influence with rank-and-file workers who came to hear her speak, but at party congresses, she often stood alone, arguing positions that were voted down by large margins. The loneliness of it wore on her. She wrote letters to friends describing her exhaustion, her sense that she was fighting a battle she could not win. And then came the summer of 1914, and everything Rosa had feared proved true in the most devastating way possible. War had been building for years, the great powers of Europe arming themselves, drawing lines, making alliances that turned the continent into a powder keg. Socialists across Europe had pledged that if war came, they would refuse to fight. Workers had no reason to kill each other for the benefit of kings and capitalists. The Second International, the organization linking socialist parties across borders, had committed to using the general strike as a weapon against war. Rosa believed this absolutely. She gave speeches warning that war would be catastrophe, that millions would die for nothing, that workers must refuse. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo in June 1914 and the dominoes began falling toward war, she felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Germany mobilized. Austria mobilized, Russia mobilized, and the German Social Democratic Party, the largest and most powerful socialist organization in the world, faced a choice. The government asked for war credits, for money to fund the army. The SPD could vote yes, supporting the German war effort, or vote no, standing by their internationalist principles. On August 4, 1914, the party caucus met to decide.
Rosa was not in the room. She was not part of the parliamentary faction, but she knew what was happening, and she could not breathe as she waited for news. The vote came back. The SPD had voted yes, 96-14. They had approved war credits. The party that had claimed to represent international working-class solidarity had chosen the German nation instead. They would support the Kaiser's war. They would send workers to die in trenches. Rosa felt the news like a physical blow. She sat in her apartment, unable to speak, unable to move. Everything she had worked for, fought for, believed in, had crumbled in a single vote. The other socialist parties across Europe did the same. French socialists supported France. British socialists supported Britain. The international working class was about to slaughter itself, and the parties that claimed to represent them were cheering it on.
That night, Rosa walked through Berlin in a daze. The streets were full of celebration. Crowds waved flags and sang patriotic songs. Young men marched toward recruitment centers, excited, convinced the war would be over by Christmas. The city was delirious with nationalist fervor, and Rosa moved through it like a ghost, seeing already the millions of corpses this enthusiasm would produce. She went home and began to write. If the party had betrayed its principles, she would not. If the movement had collapsed, she would build something new. The war would end eventually, and when it did, there would be a reckoning. Rosa Luxemburg would make sure of it. But first, she had to survive. And survival in wartime Germany for someone like her would prove almost impossible. The authorities were already watching, already preparing to silence the one voice that refused to celebrate the march toward annihilation. The orator who made crowds weep was about to learn what it meant to be locked away where no one could hear her speak at all. The darkness was coming, and Rosa walked toward it with her eyes open, her limp more pronounced than ever, her small body carrying a weight that would have crushed someone less determined. Ahead lay prison cells and broken health, letters written by candlelight, and birds watched through barred windows. Ahead lay the slow, terrible grinding of the wars she had tried to prevent. But also ahead, though she could not know it yet, lay a few more years of fierce life, of love found in unexpected places, of words written in darkness that would outlive the war and the empire and everyone who tried to silence her. The story was far from over. It was, in some ways, only beginning. The first arrest came in February 1915. Rosa had been speaking against the war at closed meetings, writing pamphlets under pseudonyms, organizing a small group of socialists who refused to abandon their principles. The police had been watching for months, waiting for the right moment. They came for her early in the morning, knocking on her door with that particular authoritative rhythm that means you have no choice. She was taken to the women's prison in Barnumstrasse, a gray building that smelled of carbolic soap and despair. The cell was small, perhaps 10 feet by 6, with a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a window set high in the wall. The walls were thick enough that sound barely penetrated. When the door closed behind her, Rosa felt the weight of silence settle like a physical thing. This would be her world, on and off, for most of the next 4 years. Arrested, released, arrested again, moved from prison to prison. Barnumstrasse, then Ronke Fortress in Posen, then Breslau. Each place had its own particular character of bleakness. But Rosa discovered something unexpected in that forced solitude. She discovered parts of herself she had never allowed to surface before. The war raged beyond the prison walls. Millions of men were dying in trenches filled with mud and rats and poison gas. The casualty lists grew longer each week, columns of names in newspapers that Rosa was sometimes permitted to read. She thought about those men, workers in different uniforms, killing each other because their leaders had told them to. The waste of it made her physically ill. But she could do nothing from inside these walls except write, and so she wrote with an intensity that frightened her guards. Letters first, hundreds of them to friends who remained free. Sophie Liebknecht received letters almost weekly, long outpourings of thought and feeling. Mathilde Worm, Louise Kautsky, Clara Zetkin all became recipients of Rosa's prison correspondence. She wrote about politics, yes, but also about everything else. Books she was reading, dreams she had, the quality of light at different times of day.
The letters revealed a Rosa that few had seen before. The fierce revolutionary was also someone who noticed butterflies and wept over cruelty to animals. One letter, written from Runke in December 1917, described an incident that shattered her. She had been in the prison courtyard when a wagon arrived, pulled by buffalo instead of the usual horses. The animals were war plunder from Romania, and they had been driven so hard that blood ran from their wounds. The soldiers beat them when they struggled with the heavy load. Rosa watched one buffalo, its hide torn and bleeding, stand absolutely still while tears ran from its eyes. She wrote that she felt a kinship with that creature, both of them trapped, both beaten, both somehow still alive despite everything. The image haunted her. She stood in the courtyard and wept openly, and when a guard tried to lead her away, she could not move. The buffalo's suffering had broken through all her intellectual defenses and touched something raw. This tenderness was not weakness. It was the other side of her revolutionary passion. Rosa fought for a better world because she felt the world's pain so acutely. She could not distance herself, could not develop the protective cynicism that let others survive. Every cruelty cut her, every injustice wounded. And in prison, stripped of political activity, she felt everything with an intensity that sometimes overwhelmed her. But she also found unexpected beauty. The prison at Runke was a fortress, cold and ancient, but it had grounds where prisoners were sometimes allowed to walk. Rosa spent hours in that small space, watching birds with the attention of a naturalist. She learned to identify species by their calls. She tracked their comings and goings, their mating rituals, their fights over territory. In letters, she described these observations with a precision that rivaled her political writing. She read voraciously. The prison library was limited, but friends sent books. She worked her way through Russian literature, reading Tolstoy and Dostoevsky in the original. She translated Russian poetry into German, finding in the work a meditation that calmed her restless mind. She read natural history, economics, philosophy, novels. Reading became a form of freedom, a way to travel beyond the walls. And slowly, unexpectedly, she began to experience something like peace. Not happiness, exactly. The war was still raging, her health was deteriorating, and she had no idea when or if she would be released. But a kind of acceptance settled over her. She wrote to Sophie that she felt like a bird that had been battered by storms, but still sang because singing was its nature.
The guards did not know what to make of her. Most prisoners became smaller in captivity, broken by the routine humiliation and isolation. Rosa seemed to grow larger. She demanded books, writing materials, better food. She complained about conditions not just for herself, but for other prisoners. She organized, even in prison, getting women to petition for changes, to support each other. One guard, a young man named Hans Diefenbach, was assigned to watch her during exercise periods. He had been wounded at the front, sent home with a leg injury that left him limping. Perhaps that shared physical limitation created a bond, or perhaps it was simply that Hans had never met anyone like Rosa. He was supposed to keep her from talking to other prisoners, to monitor her for signs of seditious activity. Instead, he found himself talking with her. Rosa asked him about the war, about what he had seen. Hans had never spoken about it to anyone. The horror of the trenches was something you did not share with civilians who could not understand. But Rosa listened with such complete attention that the words came out despite himself. The fear, the cold, the friends who died next to him, the senselessness of it all. She did not pity him. She was angry on his behalf, angry that he had been used and damaged and sent home to guard prisoners while others continued dying. She talked to him about why the war was happening,
about the economic forces that drove nations to slaughter their own people. And Hans, who had never thought about such things, found himself questioning everything he had been told. He began bringing her things, small contraband items, books that were not officially permitted, newspapers that gave her news of the war's progress. It was dangerous. If discovered, he could be court-martialed. But Hans found he could not refuse her. There was something about Rosa that made you want to help her, to be worthy of the faith she seemed to have in human possibility. Their relationship remained proper, bounded by the walls and rules that separated them, but there was tenderness in it, a mutual recognition. Hans represented the workers Rosa had spent her life fighting for, the ordinary people ground up by systems they did not create, and Rosa represented something Hans had not known existed, a vision of the world that made his suffering mean something beyond itself.
Through Hans, Rosa learned more about what was happening beyond the prison. The war was not going as the government claimed. Soldiers were deserting, strikes were breaking out in factories. The home front was cracking under the strain of years of deprivation. People were hungry, exhausted, losing faith in promises of victory. Rosa absorbed this information and began to hope that the war might end not in victory for either side, but in revolution. She started writing something larger than letters, a pamphlet carefully hidden from the regular inspections, passed piece by piece to friends on the outside. She called it The Crisis of Social Democracy, but it would become known by its pseudonymous signature, Junius. The name came from a mysterious 18th century writer who had attacked the British government with anonymous letters. Rosa borrowed the identity to attack her own government. The Junius pamphlet was a comprehensive demolition of everything the German Social Democrats had done since voting for war credits. Rosa traced how the party had betrayed its principles, how it had become complicit in mass murder, how it had traded internationalism for nationalism. But more than that, she articulated a vision of what had to come next. The war would end eventually, and when it did, workers had to be ready to seize power, to prevent another catastrophe, to finally build the society they had been promised. Writing it gave Rosa purpose. Each page was an act of defiance against the silence the authorities wanted to impose. She wrote in the early mornings when the light was best, her handwriting growing smaller to conserve paper. She revised obsessively, trying to make every sentence clear and sharp. This had to work not just as theory, but as a tool, something that could be used when the moment came. The pamphlet was smuggled out page by page, reassembled on the outside, and published illegally in 1916. Thousands of copies circulated through the underground network of anti-war socialists. Police raids seized caches of it. People were arrested for possessing it. And Rosa, in her cell, learned through secret communications that her words were reaching workers, giving voice to doubts they had been afraid to speak. But the cost of this resistance was her body. Prison food was barely adequate even for healthy prisoners, and Rosa had never been healthy. Her stomach troubles worsened. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. The cold and damp aggravated her hip, making walking painful. She developed headaches that lasted for days, blinding her, making it impossible to read or write. The prison doctors were indifferent. She was a political prisoner, someone the authorities wanted to suffer. When she complained of symptoms, they prescribed rest and implied she was malingering. Friends on the outside tried to petition for her release on medical grounds, but the requests were denied. Rosa was too dangerous to let go.
She marked time by small rituals, the arrival of letters, which came irregularly and heavily censored, the changing of seasons visible through her high window, the flowers that bloomed in the exercise yard each spring, tiny rebellions of color against the gray stone. She learned to find joy in incremental things, a practice that would have seemed impossible to her younger self, who had lived at such intensity. In the winter of 1917, the Russian Revolution erupted. News reached Rosa in fragments, censored reports and rumors, but enough to understand that the unthinkable had happened. Workers and soldiers had overthrown the Tsar. They were creating Soviets, democratic councils. They were taking Russia out of the war.
everything Rosa had predicted, everything she had hoped for was happening, just not in Germany, where she sat locked away. She felt the bitter irony of it. While she wasted in prison, the revolution she had spent her life working toward was being made by others. She wanted desperately to be there, to participate, to help shape what came next. Instead, she could only write more letters, more analysis, trying to influence events from a distance that made her input almost meaningless. But she also felt vindication. The reformists had been wrong. Revolution was not a romantic fantasy. It was possible, even in the 20th century, even in the age of modern states and professional armies. Workers could take power if they acted collectively and refused to submit. Russia proved it. And if Russia, why not Germany? The question consumed her. She studied every scrap of information about the Russian Revolution, trying to understand its dynamics. She wrote notes for an essay analyzing what the Bolsheviks had done right and where she thought they were making mistakes. She worried that Lenin was concentrating too much power in the party, suppressing the democratic impulses that had made the revolution possible. But she also recognized that they were navigating impossible circumstances, and perhaps some of their authoritarian measures were temporary necessities.
The winter of 1917 turned into the spring of 1918, and Rosa remained in prison. She had been locked up for 3 years, with only brief periods of freedom when the authorities released her and then arrested her again when she immediately resumed anti-war activities. Her friends barely recognized her when they were permitted visits. The vital, energetic woman they had known was now frail, her face thin, her eyes carrying a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. But her mind remained sharp. She continued to write, to analyze, to plan for a future she had to believe was coming. In her cell at Breslau, where she spent the final months of her imprisonment, Rosa began working on a manuscript about the Russian Revolution. She wanted to write something comprehensive, a study that would capture both the achievement and the dangers of what was happening in the East. The work gave her days structure. She rose early before the other prisoners and wrote in the gray dawn light. The words came slowly now. Her hand cramped, her eyes struggled with the small print of the sources she was trying to cite from memory. But she persisted because this was what she did. This was who she was, a writer, a thinker, someone who tried to understand the forces shaping history so that people could act more consciously within them. She worried about what would come after the war. Germany was collapsing slowly, the economy strangled by the British blockade, the army bleeding out in futile offensives. The revolution she had predicted was approaching. She could feel it in the reports that reached her, in the increasing desperation of the censors who cut more and more from her letters. But what kind of revolution would it be? Would the workers be ready? Would there be leaders who understood what needed to be done? Rosa thought about her own role. She was 47 years old, her health ruined, her energy depleted. The fierce young woman who had electrified crowds seemed very far away. But she also knew that if the moment came, she would have to rise to it. There was no one else who held the position she held, trusted by workers but uncompromised by the war, capable of articulating a vision that went beyond the tired formulas of the old party leadership. In October 1918, the German High Command finally admitted what everyone already knew: the war was lost. The request for an armistice came, and with it came the beginning of the end. Sailors in Kiel mutinied rather than sail on a final suicidal mission. Soldiers refused orders. Workers walked out of factories. The revolutionary wave that had started in Russia was finally crashing over Germany. Rosa heard the news in her cell and felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. Not the intellectual certainty that the system would eventually collapse, but the visceral hope that comes from seeing the possible become actual. The prison guards grew nervous. They did not know who they were guarding anymore, or by whose authority. The old order was dissolving, and no one knew what would take its place. On November 8, 1918, Rosa Luxemburg walked out of Breslau prison. She had been released as part of a general amnesty for political prisoners, the new government's attempt to curry favor with the left.
She stood in the street outside the prison gates, blinking in the autumn sunlight, breathing air that was not filtered through bars. She was free, and Germany was convulsing, and she had work to do. A car waited to take her to Berlin. Friends had arranged it, people who had kept her network alive while she was locked away. As the car pulled away from the prison, Rosa looked back at the building where she had spent so much of the past 4 years. She thought about the buffalo she had seen, bleeding and weeping. She thought about Hans Diefenbach and the other broken soldiers. She thought about all the letters she had written, all the small acts of resistance that had kept her human in a place designed to break her. The prison had not broken her. It had refined her, burned away everything inessential, left her harder and clearer and somehow more tender. She knew things now that she had only theorized before. She knew what it meant to be powerless, to watch catastrophe unfold from behind walls, to feel time slow to the rhythm of a cell. And she knew that she would never take freedom for granted again. The car drove through the German countryside toward Berlin, passing villages where red flags hung from windows. The revolution had come, just as Rosa had said it would. But it was fragile, uncertain, vulnerable to sabotage from within and attack from without. The hardest work still lay ahead. Rosa sat in the back seat, her body aching from the journey, her mind already planning. There were newspapers to publish, speeches to give, organizations to build. She had lost 4 years to prison, but she would not lose a single day more. Whatever time remained to her, she would spend it fighting for the vision that had sustained her through the darkness. The city appeared on the horizon, sprawling and smoking. Berlin was in chaos, workers and soldiers controlling the streets, the old government fled or cowering. Rosa leaned forward, her heart beating faster. She was going back into the storm, back to the place where words could still change the world, where crowds gathered to hear truth spoken plainly. The prisoner was free, the orator was returning, and history, that vast and impersonal force Rosa had spent her life trying to understand, was about to accelerate in ways that would give her one last chance to shape its direction. The final act was beginning, and though Rosa could not know it, she had only 67 days left. But what days they would be, what fierce, burning, consequential days. Berlin in November 1918 was a city that had forgotten how to be itself. The Kaiser had fled to Holland in the middle of the night like a thief escaping his own house. The government that had prosecuted the war with such certainty had simply evaporated, leaving a vacuum that no one quite knew how to fill. In the streets, workers and soldiers wore red armbands and carried rifles they had taken from armories that no longer had guards. The old order had collapsed so completely that it seemed almost impossible it had ever existed at all. Rosa arrived at the apartment of her friend Clara Zetkin and collapsed in a chair, exhausted from the journey. Clara looked at her with concern that she tried to hide. Rosa had aged a decade in 4 years. Her hair had gone gray. Her face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent. She moved with even more difficulty than before, her hip having deteriorated further in the cold prison cells. But her eyes still burned with that unmistakable intensity, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same clarity that had always made people listen. There was no time to rest. Leo Jogicus appeared within hours, their old relationship transformed now into something purely political, the romantic complications burned away by years of separation. He brought news, information, analysis. The Social Democrats under Friedrich Ebert had formed a provisional government and were calling for elections to a constituent assembly. They spoke of democracy and reform, but they were also making deals with the army, with the old industrial powers, with everyone who wanted to prevent the revolution from going too far.
Rosa understood the pattern immediately. This was 1848 all over again. The bourgeoisie would use the workers' energy to overthrow the old regime, then turn around and crush the workers to prevent them from taking power themselves. It was already happening. Ebert had appointed Gustav Noske as defense minister, and Noske was recruiting Freikorps units, paramilitary groups made up of demobilized soldiers who hated socialists more than they hated the lost war. She and Leo, along with Karl Liebknecht, who had also just been released from prison, began publishing a newspaper. They called it Die Rote Fahne, the Red Flag. The first issue appeared on November 18th, just 10 days after Rosa's release. The editorial offices became a whirlwind of activity, writers and printers and messengers coming and going at all hours. Rosa wrote article after article, her pen moving across paper with the urgency of someone who knew time was short. In her writings, she tried to articulate a path between two dangers. On one side was the social democratic government, which wanted to channel revolutionary energy into parliamentary forms that would neutralize it. On the other side were those in her own camp who wanted an immediate armed uprising, a seizure of power by force. Rosa argued for something more difficult and more subtle. The revolution had to deepen organically, spreading through the creation of workers' councils that would become an alternative source of power. It could not be decreed from above or forced before the masses were ready. But she also knew that the moment was fleeting. The window of possibility would not stay open forever. The old powers were regrouping, gathering their strength. Every day that passed without a clear revolutionary victory was a day the counter-revolution grew stronger. On December 30th, 1918, Rosa attended the founding Congress of the Communist Party of Germany. It met in the Prussian House of Representatives, an ironic location for a gathering of revolutionaries. About 100 delegates crowded into a hall, mostly young, mostly workers, burning with enthusiasm and impatience. They wanted action. They wanted to storm the government buildings and proclaim a Soviet republic immediately.
Rosa stood before them and urged caution. She was not advocating patience born of cowardice, but of strategic understanding. The masses were moving toward revolutionary consciousness, but they were not there yet. Most workers still trusted the Social Democrats, and premature uprising would be crushed, and the defeat would set back the cause for years. The Communist Party's task was to participate in the struggles unfolding in factories and barracks, to help workers understand their own power, to build the councils that would become the structure of a new society. Many in the audience were disappointed. They had expected the legendary Rosa Luxemburg to call for immediate revolution. Instead, she was counseling something that sounded like hesitation. But Rosa knew the difference between revolutionary romanticism and revolutionary strategy. She had seen uprisings fail because they were launched with enthusiasm but without mass support. She would not repeat those mistakes. The debate went on for hours. Karl Liebknecht was more sympathetic to immediate action than Rosa. The delegates were split. Finally, they voted to boycott the upcoming elections to the National Assembly, a decision Rosa opposed but accepted. The party was committed now to a path of confrontation, and she would walk that path with them, even though she feared where it led. January 1919 came cold and tense. Berlin felt like a city holding its breath. The Ebert government was growing more confident, more willing to use force. When they attempted to remove Emil Eichhorn, the popular Berlin police chief who sympathized with the radical left, workers responded with mass demonstrations. 500,000 people poured into the streets on January 5th, occupying newspaper buildings, calling for the government's overthrow. Rosa and Karl found themselves swept along by events they had not initiated and could not fully control. The revolutionary shop stewards, a network of militant workers, were calling for armed insurrection. The Communist Party leadership met in emergency session to decide what to do. Rosa argued against joining an uprising that had no clear plan and no realistic chance of success, but she was outvoted. The party committed to supporting the action. For the next 3 days, Berlin teetered on the edge of civil war. Workers held buildings across the city center. The government, from its offices in the suburbs, ordered the Freikorps to restore order. These were not regular soldiers, but hardened men who had survived years of trench warfare and who blamed the left for Germany's defeat. They advanced into the city with artillery and machine guns.
Rosa worked around the clock from the newspaper offices on Wilhelmstrasse, writing articles, trying to give political direction to a movement that was fragmenting even as it fought. She slept a few hours on a couch, rising before dawn to write more. She knew the uprising was failing, but she could not abandon the workers who were fighting in the streets. Her articles tried to preserve what could be preserved, to draw lessons for next time, to keep alive the possibility that this defeat would not be final.
By January 10th, it was over. The Freikorps had retaken the occupied buildings. Workers were arrested by the hundreds. The Communist Party was driven underground. Rosa and Karl went into hiding, moving from safe house to safe house, knowing the government wanted them captured or dead. They stayed in an apartment in Wilmersdorf, a quiet neighborhood where they hoped to be anonymous. For 5 days, they barely left the building. Rosa used the enforced stillness to write, producing an article analyzing what had gone wrong. She called it "Order Prevails in Berlin," a bitter reference to the government's claims of restored peace. "Order prevails in Berlin," she wrote, "but it is the order of the graveyard." The workers had been defeated, but the struggle would continue because the underlying contradictions remained unresolved. She seemed calm during those final days, almost serene. Friends who visited commented on it. Perhaps she had accepted what was coming. Perhaps the years in prison had taught her how to find peace even in impossible circumstances. She talked about plants, about a botanical book she was reading. She made plans for articles she would write when things settled down. She spoke as if there would be a future. On the evening of January 15th, Rosa and Karl were in the apartment with a few comrades. Someone knocked on the door. Before anyone could react, Freikorps soldiers burst in, rifles raised. They had been betrayed. Someone in the building had recognized them and informed the authorities. The soldiers were young, their faces hard with contempt. They grabbed Rosa and Karl, shouting insults, shoving them toward the door. Rosa asked if she could take her coat. One of the soldiers laughed and threw it at her. She put it on slowly, carefully, her hands steady. She looked around the apartment one last time, at the books on the table, at the lamp burning peacefully, at the ordinary domestic space that had briefly been a refuge. Then she limped out into the hallway, flanked by armed men. They were taken to the Eden Hotel, which the Freikorps had turned into a headquarters. The lobby was full of soldiers drinking and celebrating. When Rosa and Karl were brought in, a cheer went up. Here were the enemies of Germany, the traitors who had stabbed the army in the back, the Jews and communists who had to be eliminated for the nation to be healthy again. The hatred in the room was physical, a pressure that made breathing difficult. Rosa was separated from Karl and taken to a room where officers questioned her. They wanted names, addresses, information about the party's underground network. She said nothing. Her silence was absolute, dignified. They could take her life, but they could not make her betray her comrades. One officer slapped her hard across the face. Her head snapped to the side, but she did not cry out. After perhaps an hour, they decided they had learned nothing useful. A captain named Waldemar Popst made a phone call, spoke quietly, then hung up. He nodded to the soldiers. The decision had been made. There would be no trial, no official execution, just an accident during transport, a regrettable incident that no one could quite explain. Rosa was led back through the lobby. Soldiers lined the route, jeering, spitting. Someone struck her in the head with a rifle butt, a savage blow that dropped her to her knees. She felt the warm wetness of blood running down her face. Hands grabbed her, lifted her, dragged her toward the door. The world tilted and blurred. Outside, a car waited, engine running. They threw her into the back seat. She lay there, barely conscious, aware of movement, of the cold night air, of voices above her discussing her as if she were already dead. The car drove through dark streets toward the Tiergarten, Berlin's great park. Near the Landwehr Canal, it stopped. One of the soldiers leaned into the back seat and fired a single shot. The sound was flat, unremarkable, swallowed by the winter night. Rosa Luxemburg's body jerked once, then was still. She was 47 years old. The journey that had begun in a small Polish town, that had carried her through universities and prisons, through love affairs and political battles, through exile and fame and isolation,
had ended on the floor of a car in the darkness. They pulled her body from the car and threw it over the railing into the canal. The splash was small, insignificant. The water closed over her, and she sank into the cold and the dark, and the soldiers drove away, already working on the story they would tell. She had been attacked by an angry crowd, they would say. They had tried to protect her but failed. These things happened in revolutionary times. No one was really to blame. Karl Liebknecht was murdered the same night, shot in the Tiergarten and delivered to a morgue as an unidentified corpse. The two leaders of German communism, the voices that had refused to be silenced, were dead within hours of each other. The government expressed regret. The Freikorps celebrated, and in the working-class districts of Berlin, people wept when they heard the news, understanding that something precious had been extinguished.
Rosa's body was not found for months. The canal was dragged but turned up nothing. Some began to hope she had somehow survived, that she was hiding, that she would return. But on May 31st, 1919, a lockkeeper found a corpse caught in the canal gate. The body was badly decomposed, barely recognizable, but the clothing matched what Rosa had been wearing. The limp in the left leg confirmed the identification beyond doubt. Thousands attended her funeral on June 13th. They marched through Berlin in silence, a river of grief and rage. The coffin was covered in red flowers. Workers who had heard her speak stood with tears streaming down their faces. The woman who had made them feel human, who had articulated their suffering and their hope, was being lowered into the ground. It felt like the death of possibility itself. But something strange happened in the years that followed. Rosa Luxemburg did not disappear into history. Instead, she grew larger, more luminous. Her writings were collected and published. Her letters from prison were read and wept over. The image of her courage, her refusal to compromise, her fierce tenderness became a kind of moral touchstone for everyone who came after. She had been right about so much. The Social Democrats had indeed betrayed the revolution, aligning with the old powers to crush the workers. The Weimar Republic they built would prove too weak to resist fascism. Within 15 years, Hitler would take power, and the nightmare Rosa had warned against would become real. The soldiers who murdered her were the same forces that would eventually murder millions. But Rosa had also been wrong about some things. The revolution she predicted did not come, not in the form she imagined. Workers did not spontaneously create a new society through their councils and strikes. The communist parties that claimed her legacy often betrayed the democratic spirit she had fought for. The Soviet Union, which she had critiqued for concentrating too much power in the party, became a bureaucratic dictatorship that would have horrified her. What remained, beyond the arguments about her political theories, was something harder to define, but perhaps more important. Rosa Luxemburg had shown that it was possible to live with absolute conviction, without becoming rigid or cruel. She had fought fiercely, but never stopped being tender. She had believed in revolution, but also in beauty, in birds, in poetry, in the small moments of grace that make life bearable. Her final article, Order Prevails in Berlin, ended with words that became her epitaph. The leadership has failed, but the leadership can and must be recreated by the masses and from the masses. The masses are the crucial factor. They are the rock on which the ultimate victory of the revolution will be built. And then, in the essay's final line, to be a human being is the main thing above all, and that means to be firm, clear, and cheerful. Yes, cheerful in spite of everything and anything, because howling is the business of the weak. She had remained cheerful, or tried to, even in prison, even in defeat, even in the moments before her death. Not cheerful in the sense of being happy, but cheerful in the sense of refusing to let darkness have the final word. She had loved the world too much to give up on it. She had believed too deeply in human possibility to become cynical. Today, more than a century after her death, Rosa Luxemburg still haunts the left as a question that will not be answered. How do you fight for justice without becoming authoritarian? How do you organize power without crushing democracy? How do you remain human while doing the inhuman work of revolutionary politics?
She did not solve these problems, but she lived them honestly, and in living them honestly, she showed that they could not be solved with simple formulas or rigid ideologies. Every year on the anniversary of her murder, people gather at the memorial in Berlin where she is buried. They bring red roses and lay them on the stone. Young and old from all over the world, they come to remember a small woman with a limp who would not be silent when silence was safer, who would not compromise when compromise would have saved her, who chose truth over survival and paid the price. The water of the Landwehr Canal still flows through Berlin, dark and quiet. The city has been rebuilt, destroyed again, rebuilt again. Empires have risen and fallen. The causes Rosa fought for have been won and lost and reborn in new forms. But the memory of her persists, carried forward by everyone who believes that the world does not have to be the way it is, that ordinary people contain extraordinary power, that justice is worth fighting for, even when the fight seems hopeless. She was thrown into a canal on a winter night, her body weighted with the hatred of those who feared what she represented. But she would not stay buried. She rose again in words, in memory, in the stubborn hope of everyone who reads her letters and feels less alone. The ghost in the machine of history, the specter that will not be exorcised, the small woman with the enormous heart who keeps asking us, century after century, what we are willing to sacrifice for the world we claim to want.
Rosa Luxemburg lived 47 years. She spent much of that time in exile, in poverty, in prison, in pain. She died violently at the hands of men who thought they could kill ideas by killing the people who carried them. They were wrong. Some lights, once lit, cannot be extinguished. Some voices, once heard, echo forever. And now, as we reach the end of her story, perhaps we can rest in the knowledge that her life meant something beyond itself, that the courage she showed makes our own courage more possible, that the world she dreamed of, however imperfectly, still calls to us across the years, asking what we will build, what we will risk, what we will become. Sleep now, knowing that the fight for justice is older than any of us and will outlast us all, that we are part of a long chain of people who refused to accept the world as it was handed to them, that Rosa Luxemburg, limping through history with her fierce intelligence and her tender heart, walks with us still, whispering that another world is possible if only we are brave enough to reach for it. The story is finished, the life is complete, but the question she lived remains, waiting for our answer, patient as stone, urgent as morning. Rest well. If this journey into Rosa's remarkable life has carried you gently towards sleep, consider leaving a like to help others find their way here. Subscribe to walk with us through more stories of extraordinary lives. And in the comments, tell us whose story you'd like us to explore next. Until then, may your dreams be peaceful, and may you wake with something of Rosa's courage in your heart.